As of filming this, we're already halfway through 2016. Can you believe it? As Magic the Gathering players, a lot of really crazy things have happened, but also a lot of good things. We've had a swarm of Eldrazi Ruin constructed formats. We've returned to one of the most renowned planes of all time, and decks win by hurting themselves. As Magic the Gathering players, you could argue that we've, played decks that rely on paying life, or losing a lot of life, or potential gain, board presence, or even card advantage since the game's creation. However, recently there's been a deck that takes this idea to, a whole new extreme. In Modern, this deck is called Death Shadow. Death Shadow is an aggro deck, but unlike a lot of aggro decks who are kind of concerned about their life total due to the fact that they put everything on the line and have kind of a go-for-broke style play, Death Shadow just doesn't really seem to care and figures it will just hurt itself. Simply because without hurting yourself, you can't really play Death Shadow, as you do need a relatively low life total for it to be a big threat. Considering the idea of this deck is to get a really big creature that relies on your low life total, the deck does everything it can to, hurt itself. This comes from using shock lands, fetch lands, or using Phyrexian spells. Heck, some decks even like to use Street Wraith. While this strategy may come off as really silly to some new players or players who haven't had a whole lot of experience playing against this deck, it's important to note that this deck can win on turn 2 due to the fact that it can just pay all its life by using lands, Phyrexian spells, and just any means necessary to get these big Death Shadows in play on turn 1, and then finish you off with something that gives the creature double strike. It's also important to note that these decks also have a lot of success because they're very deceptive. These decks like to play other aggressive creatures to come off as another sort of deck, like a burn deck, by using things like Wildnacoddle or Goblin Guide. In short, Death Shadow is really nasty because it essentially is the perfect counterattack for losing so much life. And the scary thing is, it can happen really unexpectedly and at the most inconvenient of times. Considering this deck runs so many 0-mana spells and abilities that draw cards, they will be able to get these creatures whenever they want and the pump spells needed to finish you off really quickly. While this deck is really efficient due to its card drawing power and its fast clock, it does have its weaknesses. The first weakness of the deck is the deck loves to play its hand as fast as possible. And this is going to happen a lot when you play this deck because this deck uses practically nothing but 1-mana spells. Because of the deck's obsession with 1-mana spells, cards like Chalice of the Void are absolutely brutal against it. Once you play a Chalice on 1, there's almost nothing this deck can do, unless they've thought about it ahead of time and decide to play some 2-drops. If you don't have Chalice of the Void, another good artifact to use is Engineered Explosives. But if you play this on turn 1, you can save it for that moment when the deck is about to wipe you out. Considering the deck relies on attacking and isn't usually very heavy on things like Burn, cards that prevent creatures from attacking are really, really good. Take Ensnaring Bridge, for example. Considering that Death's Shadow is likely going to be over 5 power, it should be easy to keep your hand at a low amount of cards. Just keep in mind that some creatures in the deck do have low power, so they will be able to attack before they pump them, and that attack will still get through. If you really want to play it super safe, you actually may want to try Worship. Although you will need a creature for this to work, having a Worship out really, really hurts this deck. Another weakness the deck has is if it wants to get its 2-turn win, it usually needs to have something like Become Immense, and in addition to that, have something that gives it Double Strike or Trample. Considering these spells need to target, Spellskite is wonderful in this matchup, considering that once it's out, you basically need to have a Death Shadow big enough to kill it to get through. It also makes Become Immense a lot worse. Since all the creatures in this deck are likely going to cost 1 mana, it's important that your removal spells probably cost 1 to 2 mana as well. Cards like Path to Exile are really, really good in this matchup, but if anything, my favorite 1-mana removal spell in this matchup, or against this matchup, has to be Condemn. This is often a 2-for-1 in this matchup, considering you can put another creature attacking on the bottom of its owner's library, give your opponent a ton of life, and basically kill any other Death Shadow that's on the table because you just gave your opponent a ton of life. You should also be precautious about using Lightning Bolts. Lightning Bolt isn't horrible in this matchup, but you do have to keep in mind that the deck likes to run Mutagenic Growth, and they can cast that for free and by paying life. So essentially, they'll just counter your Lightning Bolt and make their Death Shadow a lot bigger. The point is, your removal spell should knock out these creatures entirely. No doing damage, no -X, just get it off the table. That's the biggest thing you have to know. If you play black, you can also play Hand Attack, and Hand Attack is not too bad. Even cards like Thoughtseize aren't bad either, considering the deck usually will take you out in one hit. But even so, if you play Hand Attack, it's usually best to go after the creatures, even if you do have creature removal. This way, it'll make their hand look kind of silly because they'll likely have just a bunch of pump spells. The only thing you may want to be concerned about is occasionally the deck will have a protection spell, like Apostle's Blessing, which you may want to take, but ultimately you're going to want to take their creatures because those are what's going to ultimately kill you. Green's kind of in trouble in this matchup, considering it doesn't really have any way to really get creatures off the board entirely. So if you do play green and you know you're going to play this matchup, try to splice a color, like white or black, to get rid of those big creatures early on. Another big weakness the Death Shadow deck has is it doesn't run that many lands. Oddly enough, because it always wants to do damage to itself, just about every land in the deck has some way to hurt the player playing it. This means that it's chock full of fetches and shock lands, but oddly enough, most lists only run about 5 shock lands and maybe about 9 to 12 fetches. Because of the small amount of lands that are fetchable, dropping a land destruction spell or getting rid of one of these lands is huge. I mean, if you get rid of enough, they'll probably won't be able to play anything. You'll just need to find some way to stabilize before they go out of control on you. When choosing creatures to go up in this matchup, it's kind of debatable because it may not really matter which creature you choose, considering the player is likely going to give Death Shadow Trample and Double Strike. Considering Death Shadow isn't always going to be the thing you're going to be facing, it's likely best that the creatures you have either have more than 4 toughness, considering all the other creatures usually don't have more than 4 power unless they pump them, or if you have a way to generate multiple creatures, like token generators, like Lingering Souls, are really nice when you don't have to deal with a creature with trample, because you can just throw them out there and chump block all day long. Considering Death Shadows usually get really, really huge, a creature with Death Touch is actually quite nice if you're able to trade. However, you just have to watch out for that trample, which is the big thing you have to wonder, but even if that does happen, I'd still recommend taking it along in case they whiff. Although Death Shadow is an aggro deck, getting life really doesn't do a whole lot, considering the deck will usually kill you in one hit with a really large Death Shadow and some way to give it double strike and trample. In short, you're going to need to gain a lot of life, and although I don't really dislike life gaining spells, you're going to have life gaining and stability on board to really face this matchup efficiently, and that's not always so easy to do. However, one thing you may want to consider is actually giving your opponent life, considering giving them life kills their Death Shadows. The final weakness that you may want to keep in mind when playing against Death Shadow is the pretty obvious one, is they're going to be losing a lot of life. If you play a lot of evasive creatures or creatures with protection from a color, this is excellent in this matchup, considering they're going to be able to end the game for you really quickly. Much sooner than they would against any other matchup. You'll just have to find a way to stabilize, and like I say, just keep the board clean on their side. So now that you know what to do, and you know you go up against Death Shadow at your Friday Night Magic, sanctioned events, or other locations where you do play Magic, feel free to follow these strategies, and if you play your cards right, you will slay this beast. I'd also like to give a quick shout out to Nara9, who suggested the idea for this episode to me. Thank you, and I hope these strategies help you and everyone else who watches this video. If you are having trouble defeating a deck at your local game store or wherever you play Magic, feel free to let me know about it in the comment section below, and I will be more than happy to make an episode for you about how to beat that deck. Again, thank you all so much for watching. My name is Ryu Spectre, and I'll see you all next time.